Good afternoon, first of all. Welcome. It's customary to study ethics of the fathers between the two holidays of Pesach, Passover, and Shavuos. The reason for that, at least one of the reasons, is that Shavuos is when we got the Torah. But there's an expression, a Talmudic expression, that Derech Eretz Kadma LaTorah. Derech Eretz comes before Torah. What does Derech Eretz mean? In the colloquial sense of it, which is a true meaning, it means behaving like a mensch. That before you could really absorb Torah, you have to first be a decent human being. It doesn't mean you have to wait to study Torah until you're a decent human being, but it means that in order for Torah to be received, to be integrated, internalized, you have to have the right character that makes you receptive to it. And Pirkei Avos is the name in English, ethics of the fathers, although the Hebrew name is just Avot, fathers. But it's also known in English as ethics because it focuses on ethics. So we're going to start learning it, but today we'll focus on one aspect. The first Mishna, the first paragraph, talks about the transmission of Torah from Sinai down through the generations until it reached what they call the men of the Great Assembly. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the Torah was transmitted, because this is so fundamental to Judaism, and yet so many Jews are not aware of the way Torah got to us today. First, let's read the Mishna here. You have it in the Siddur. Tell you which page it is if you... No, this is a different edition. This is only Hebrew. 271. Yeah, the very beginning. Page 271. Here. Thank you. And it starts off by saying, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai. Umasara li Yoshua. He passed it down to Joshua. Yeshua l'zkanim. Joshua passed it to the elders, whoever they were. Doesn't say. It was Canaan, the elders, l'neviim, to the prophets. L'neviim and the prophets, Masarua, passed it down la'anshe knesses hagdola, to the men of the great assembly. And then it tells you the things that they said, which we won't go into now. We'll just focus now on the transmission. What this is telling us is the major commentary on the Mishnah, and he's known as the Bar Tanura, not to be confused with the wine. Right, the Bar Tanura is the name of a city in Italy, and his name was not Bar Tanura, his name was Rabbi Avadia, Bar Tanura, from Bar Tanura. So that's how he's referred to. The Bar Tanura says, they named the wine after him. That's because some person heard that Rashi was a vintner. Although it's not 100% sure that that's true, but that's the tradition. So someone made a kosher wine company and called it Rashi. So someone says, you know what, that's a great idea. Let's name wines after great rabbis. And then there's Bartanura, they have Rambam. They have Rambam now. They have Abarbanel, they have Rekanati. These are all names of great Talmudic or Kabbalistic sages. But this is the real Bartanura. This is the rabbi from Bartanura. He lived about 600 years ago. And in his commentary he says, and there are others who say the same thing, that the reason why ethics of the fathers is introduced with this order of transmission is to tell us that unlike other ethical systems that are based on human reasoning and change with the times, not only is Jewish law divine because it was given at Mount Sinai, but the ethics were also given at Mount Sinai. They're not situational, they're not relative to the period in which we live. So here's where the Mishnah provides us with the initial generations or periods of Torah transmission. The first was, of course, Moses. Moses received the Torah at Sinai. What did he receive? He was there 40 days and 40 nights. How many reruns could you watch? How many soap operas could you watch in 40 days and 40 nights? What was he doing all this time? He wasn't eating, he wasn't drinking, didn't go out to restaurants, he wasn't doing anything that takes up so much time. What was he doing in those 40 days? Getting the 10 commandments? You mean it took God 40 days to etch the 10 commandments into the stone? So the answer is he was being taught all of Torah. He was given all of the knowledge of Judaism in a nutshell, because in 40 days you can't really go through all the knowledge in Judaism. I mean, even if you look at libraries that we have today, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of volumes, but all of the knowledge of Torah that was ever conceived of by any human being was all implicit in the knowledge that he got in those 40 days and 40 nights. So God gave him the totality of Torah in a basic, fundamental form, you could say an outline, in which everything can be found. And he transmitted that later on to the Jewish people, and the one who he gave most of the knowledge was Joshua, which is the next step. Now, what exactly do we mean when we say he received the Torah? Most people, when you say the word Torah, not incorrectly, assume you're talking about the 5 books of Moses. Well, obviously, he couldn't have gotten the 5 books of Moses, because then he would have already known that he was going to hit the rock, as opposed to speaking to the rock, and because of that he would be punished, that he wouldn't be able to enter into the promised land. So he wouldn't have done that. So obviously he didn't get the entire 5 books of Moses. He got all of the knowledge that was already in existence. Everything up to that point he got at Mount Sinai. And that is what we call the written Torah, because God told him and dictated to him what to write. But then he also got what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. What is the oral Torah? The oral Torah is the interpretation and the application of all that is in the written Torah, and the way it becomes relevant and the way it relates to every issue that we confront in our lives. And this oral interpretation, to give you just a few examples, it says in the Torah, don't do malacha on Shabbat. What does malacha mean? So people translate it as work, labor. That's not what it means. It means 39 categories of activity that was involved in the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. That's what malacha means. But it doesn't say that in the Torah. It's hinted, because the Torah juxtaposes the laws against doing malacha on Shabbat with the construction of the Mishkan. But Moses was told by God that's what it means. When it says in the Torah that on Rosh Hashanah, well, it doesn't say Rosh Hashanah, it says the first day of the 7th month is a day of blowing. It doesn't say that that's Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't say it's a day of judgment. It doesn't say you're supposed to blow a shofar. You could blow a kazoo perhaps. It doesn't say what you blow. But yet we know that we blow a shofar, and we've never blown anything else on Rosh Hashanah, and we call it Rosh Hashanah. That was all part of an oral transmission. And I can go on and on. It says in the Torah, I'll give you an example, not from a law. It says that Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain got married, he had children. Who did he marry? It doesn't say in the Torah who he married. The only woman that we read about is Eve, his mother. So the answer is he did commit incest, but with his twin sister, because they were born with twin sisters. And in fact, the argument between Cain and Abel, according to the Midrash, was that there was an additional twin sister, and each one wanted to marry the additional twin sister. That's a separate subject. I'm not going to go into that, how the world started with incest. But at any rate, that's all in the oral tradition. When it says on the holiday of Sukkot, you're supposed to take a beautiful fruit, or fruit of a beautiful tree, no one that I know of, that I've ever spoken to, if they were told that they have to identify a beautiful fruit, would have said it means an etrog. Most human beings don't even know that the etrog exists. unless you come from Italy or Israel or you're Jewish and you know a little bit about Jewish tradition. So all of this, how do we know what it means? It was all given over in the oral law. One more example, an eye for an eye. The Torah says a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye. There was never a time in Jewish history when we were actually practicing the eye for an eye. Not because it's cruel and it's horrific to think of we're going to take out an eye, because we do take a life for a life. We did have that capital punishment for murder, but not an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. How do we know that it doesn't mean an eye for an eye? That was given over in the oral tradition. And that, likewise, virtually every page of the Torah, every paragraph, every sentence, and actually every word of the Torah has deeper meaning that was transmitted orally. And that's what Moses taught the Jewish people when he came down from the mountain. But who did he give over the bulk of his knowledge? One person in particular, that was Joshua. Why Joshua of all people? Because Joshua was the most devoted student. He never departed from the tent, it says. He never left Moses' presence, except when Moses went up on the mountain, he pitched his tent right next to the mountain, so he didn't even know that the Jews were worshiping the golden calf. Okay, so now Joshua, but he didn't just teach the Torah to Joshua, he taught it to all the Jewish people. And just to respond to an obvious question that people have, if the Torah was passed down orally for thousands of years, hundreds of years, actually until the Mishna was written, we're talking about a period of, Mishna was written about 2,000 years ago, a little less than 2,000 years ago, so we're talking about 1,500 years that the Torah was oral. Can't some of it get lost? When you try to transmit something orally and then someone tells someone else, you know, the game of telephone where you start off with one word and it ends up something totally different. Well, the difference between that game and what happened with Torah is that the Torah is not a game. People were not doing it for fun. People were basing their lives and gave their lives for the Torah, and it wasn't one person whispering one word to another person who then whispered the word to a third person, and the first person doesn't hear what he's whispering. We're talking about the entire Jewish people was involved in the transmission of Torah, because there's no other culture in the world that I'm aware of, unless somewhere in the Amazon, that requires every single member of that group to study its teachings and to teach it. There is no such thing as a Jew who is not a teacher, because if you know one letter of Torah and someone doesn't know that, you're obligated to teach that one letter. So every Jew is involved. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews involved in transmitting the knowledge. If someone's going to come along and try to distort something, they'd immediately be checked and corrected. So Moses gives the Torah, whatever his knowledge, to the entire Jewish people, but specifically Joshua was the one in charge. Joshua gives it to the elders. It doesn't say who these elders were, because these were not just one group of people, but it's all the leaders of the Jewish people up until the time of the prophets. Who was the first prophet that were, in the terms of the era of prophecy? There were prophets before. Moses, of course, was the greatest prophet, and then he had 70 elders that were also prophets. But these are the elders that lived between Moses and Joshua and Samuel, Shmuel. Shmuel was like the beginning of the era of prophecy, and he is the one who established the monarchy. He anointed King Saul, Shaul, and then King David. And then the prophets lasted for many generations, and then the first temple was destroyed, the second temple was rebuilt, and the next group was called the Men of the Great Assembly. It's 120 sages, among them prophets, among them the last three prophets of the era of prophecy, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These are the last three biblical books and the last prophets, and they were the heirs, the Men of the Great Assembly were the heirs to the era of prophecy. And these are the people who actually reestablished Judaism in the land of Israel, because when the Jews were in Babylonia in exile or in Persia, many of them assimilated and lost their connection to Jewish tradition. They didn't even know what Rosh Hashanah was. Even today, how many Jews do you know that never heard of Rosh Hashanah? Well, their assimilation is a very insidious process, and it could in 70 years, you could lose everything. Look what happened to Jews in the Soviet Union. 70 years, and there was virtually no trace of Judaism left. So many Russian Jews were, not to the fault of their own, of course, know nothing about Judaism. So the men of the Great Assembly were the next generation. What happened after the men of the Great Assembly? The next era was the era of the zugos, the pairs. That's what is going to be discussed later on. These were two leading rabbis who presided over the Sanhedrin. In order to keep Judaism as a vibrant way of law, of living, and to keep the laws alive, you had to have a body like the Supreme Court. The Sanhedrin's function was, unlike the Supreme Court, not just to adjudicate questions that came to them. Their role was to spread Jewish knowledge throughout all of Israel. And they would have to travel from town to town to make sure that everyone is aware of what Judaism says about whatever issues were relevant at the time. And these sages in the Sanhedrin were the greatest scholars, and they had to be the most pious and the greatest scholars. And the leadership of the Sanhedrin consisted of two people. One was the Av Bezdin, the father of the court, so to speak. He was the internal leader. And then there was the Nasi, the president, who was involved in the court, but he was also the political leader of the Jewish people, or the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, because it also went parallel with the monarchy in the Second Temple era. But the truth is, the Sanhedrin always existed. We always had a body, even in the days of Moses, of 71 sages that were considered to be the Supreme Court. So any question that could not be responded to, couldn't be answered by a lower court, would go to the Sanhedrin. After the period of the Zugot, which ended with Hillel and Shammai, that was a very difficult time for the Jewish people. The Romans were taking over, and the Sanhedrin was no longer a unified body. The Jewish community split into two schools, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And they had arguments, and then they would come to a vote. And whatever was the majority, and Hillel usually was the school of Hillel was the majority, that became Jewish law forever. So that's why, whenever they have a dispute, the school of Hillel, school of Shammai, we follow the school of Hillel. From Hillel and Shammai onward, we refer to the period as the period of Tanaim, which simply means teachers. And these were the rabbis who were no different from the early generations. There's a professor, Lawrence Schiffman. He's a professor at NYU who's an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he says one of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrated was that, contrary to the secular notion that Tanaim, like they created rabbinic Judaism. That's a bunch of nonsense. Rabbinic Judaism existed with Moses, and they didn't change anything. The only thing that changed was, instead of having a unified body that would have a vote on matters of Jewish law that were in doubt, it now was split into different schools. And therefore it was possible to have within the Jewish community, just as we have today, great rabbis who followed one way of doing things whenever there were questions, and another group would do things differently. The school of Shammai, when they would light their Hanukkah candles, they would light it 8 the first night, 7 the second night, and so on. And the school of Hillel followers would do it the other way around, the way we do it. And likewise with all their other disputes. So what happened was not that rabbinic Judaism changed, it just changed in terms of the unity. We don't have a unified way of doing things. Today we have Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Those are two different legitimate approaches to halakha. As long as the fundamental basis for law is that this is God's law that was given over to human beings who are great scholars who interpret the law based on the principles that were given down from Mount Sinai. Even if we come up with different results, as long as the two sides are using legitimate approaches, they are considered to be divine. For a simple reason. God gives the Torah to humans. Not to angels, not to animals, not even to mastodons. I pick on him. I pick on him, right? He gave it to humans, and what does God know about humans? What does, if we know it, then He certainly knows it. That you have two Jews, you have at least two opinions, or any two human beings, right? Sometimes three or four. Sometimes you don't even agree with yourself. I know people who will argue a point convincingly when they're arguing with someone, and they'll really forcefully advocate their position. A week later, they're arguing with someone else who has that position, and they'll argue just as forcefully against it, even though they were the ones who had the opposite view. So we do have different ways of thinking. God knows that. So He put the knowledge in the hands of human beings. As long as you don't use illegitimate ways of judging things by saying, well, what is in it for me if I judge this way? That's why, interestingly, the Kohen Gadol could not be on a court when they had to decide whether they would make the year a leap year. A leap year means you add another month. Why would you add another month? So the solar and lunar calendars have parity, because otherwise Pesach would be in the summer or the winter, and it would go around the annual cycle. So we have to add another month, and every year the Sanhedrin, the judges, would come together to decide whether to make this an extra leap year, or extra month, to make it into a leap year. A Kohen Gadol would not be allowed to be on that panel. Why not? Because the Kohen Gadol had to do the service on Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol was usually not a youngster, not a spring chicken. And he had to do it barefoot, on marble, on stone floor. It gets cold. So the Kohen Gadol would rather not have to have another month added on, because if another month is added on, Yom Kippur will come out a little later, a few weeks later, and it gets colder. So he might, in his mind, because he has a vested interest in not having a leap year, he might vote against the leap year. Now, this may not be conscious. This might be subconscious. Because if you have a vested interest in something, you will sometimes use it to your advantage. So as long as the judge does not think ahead of time, you know what, if I rule this way, then I'm going to have this advantage, or I know my congregants demand certain things from me, and I think I might get a raise if I rule that you're allowed to do this, or I might lose my job. You can't let other people's views, interests, get in the way of judging. As long as you have that objectivity, although no human being can be totally objective, then that's whom God gave the Torah to. And therefore, they are considered, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, the Talmud says, are both the words of the living God. They're both divine. God put it into the minds of different and opposite thinking individuals. So here's the Torah now in the hands of the Tanaim. They're passing it down orally, but people could say, well, how could you transmit so much knowledge orally? Yes, there are people who have phenomenal memories, but how many people have those phenomenal memories? Not everyone has that. When they burnt the Talmud in France, King Louis, so-called St. Louis, they burnt 24 wagon loads of Talmud, handwritten copies. That was before the printing press. How did the people in France study Talmud? One of the rabbis memorized it word for word. I knew several people who knew the Talmud word for word by heart. And I tested them. It wasn't just, well, they had me test them. So they said, and there were many more. But still, many more means, let's say, a few dozen people like that in the world. But the truth is, they did write the teachings of the oral Torah in what was called secret Megillot, secret scrolls, which meant it wasn't secret because it was banned or anything, but they weren't supposed to use it in teaching. There had to be a human communication between one generation and the other. But before you would give a lecture, the teacher would consult his notes and then give an oral lecture and not give his students the notes, so that the students would not think, well, I don't have to listen to the lecture, I'll just read the notes later on. And the danger of that is, if you ever look at a professor's notes and you try to reconstruct the lecture based on it, I guarantee you the professor himself wouldn't be able to do it a week later after he gave the lecture, let alone someone else is trying to do that. So you have to have this oral tradition, but they had notes so they can allow themselves to have a recollection of the laws. But the first time they actually put the oral law into writing, at least an outline of it, was in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, as he was called. He was the leader of the Jewish people. He was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Nasi, but he was also regarded as the political leader of the Jewish people. There was no king then. This is after the Romans destroyed the temple a century later. But he had a very good rapport with the Roman emperor, and he was very wealthy, so he was able to organize all the rabbis, and they collected all of the oral teachings. They took all the notes they had, and he wrote the Mishna. This is the first time an attempt was made to put Jewish law into writing. And the Mishnah was designed to not be that clear. It was designed to be cryptic, so that on one hand, it wouldn't be forgotten, because the Jews are now becoming dispersed all over. But at the same time, you would still need a teacher. You couldn't just read Mishnah and know what the Mishnah is talking about. Sometimes the Mishnah would say things using shorthand, leave out words deliberately, leave out even sentences deliberately. But the teachers would know what it meant, so they had an outline of Jewish law. Then his students took a lot of the material that was left out of the Mishnah, and they composed other books called Tosefta, Braita, Sifra, Sifri, Mechilta, and several other works, midrashic works that are commentaries on the Torah, as well as extensions of the Mishnah. What was the name of? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. He's also known by 2 other titles. He's known as Rebbe, or Rabbi, my rabbi, or Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy teacher. Which is interesting. He was the wealthiest, not only wealthiest Jew alive, his wealth would rival the wealth of the Roman emperor. And yet he's called the holy, and that ties in with this week's parsha called Kedoshim. Kedoshim means holy. So people think, what is holy? Holy is someone who is sitting on top of a mountain and meditating on God and doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, doesn't have anything to do with his physical world, is celibate and so on. And that's what holiness means. And obviously you can't be very rich. You can't be a multi-billionaire and still be holy. No, that's not true. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the only rabbi of the Talmud who was given that title. He's referred to this day. If you say Rabbeinu HaKadosh, we know who it's referring to, even though he was the wealthiest person alive at that time. But I'm not going to go into his wealth right now. Just the fact that he had wealth enabled him to gather all these rabbis and to support them and to allow for the oral law to be put into writing. But then the problems first began. Jews are becoming dispersed. Israel is no longer the center of Jewry because of persecution. The Romans were not exactly that favorably disposed to the Jewish people. Jews are now mostly congregated in Babylonia, which is now Iraq. And Jews are becoming dispersed even beyond that. The Romans took the Jews to Germany, to France, to England. Jews are going to North Africa. So what happened was there was a need to interpret the Mishnah. So the rabbis got together, and for 200 years, they were arguing, debating, interpreting, clarifying the Mishnah. Finally, they put those teachings into writing in 2 different periods. One was about a century after the Mishnah was written. They then put together what is called the Jerusalem Talmud. It was not written in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, so it's called the Jerusalem Talmud, Talmud Yerushalmi. And a century later, they compiled the Talmud Bavli, which is a collection of the statements, interpretations, commentary, arguments, and legal decisions of generations of rabbis. And then that became the text of Judaism, more than or equal to the 5 books of Moses. In fact, if you had to go to a deserted island, you can only take one set of books with you. You could either take the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, or the Talmud. You would have a hard time deciding which should you take with you. Because the 5 books of Moses without the Talmud is unintelligible. It's too cryptic. The Talmud without the 5 books of Moses, you'd lose a lot of the inspiration that you get from it. So it's a big, better don't go to a deserted island. That's my advice. But in case you had no choice, those are the 2 that you would have to struggle with, which was more important. After the Talmud was written, now the centers of Jewry are still spreading even beyond where they were before, and everyone is now studying Talmud. That became the major text, and there was a period called the Gaonic period. These are the rabbis mostly in Babylonia. The leading rabbi was called Gaon, which means genius or excellency. He was the leader of the Jewish people at that time. There were usually 2 because there were 2 centers of scholarship in Babylonia. And what they did is they wrote many books, although most of what they wrote we don't have. But what they did is they took the Talmud, because the Talmud became a difficult book for people to navigate, and they took parts of the Talmud and they rewrote it in language that makes it more accessible to people. There was one rabbi called Rabbi Achai, who lived about 1400 years ago. He took the entire Talmudic literature, condensed it according to the weekly Torah portion. So when people would come to shul and read the Torah portion, they would read his commentary and they would get the oral laws, statements about the weekly Torah portion. It made it a little bit easier for people to study. And other rabbis wrote major works of Jewish law focusing on one subject or several subjects. And another thing that was being done was to list the 613 commandments. The Talmud says there are 613 commandments. Now, where did I pull the number out of thin air? Is it a real number? Well, if you want to just give a round figure, you would never say 613. You would say 600. So, but if you count the number of times you read in the Torah, do this, don't do this, the bad news is it's much more than 613. The good news is that a lot of the commandments are repetitious. So for example, it says in the Torah, don't do melacha on Shabbat many times. In the 10 Commandments, which are mentioned twice in the Torah, in the Parsha of Kisisa and the Parsha of Vayakhel, it's mentioned many times, but it's only one commandment. And likewise other things. But then there were disputes. What are exactly the 613? How do you categorize it? And the rabbis were engaged in that exercise, writing books. There's a book by Rabbi Sadia Gaon where he lists the 613 commandments in rhyme. And it's about 2 pages, the whole book. A rabbi, actually he was a businessman in Warsaw before the war, wrote a commentary on it, 2,000 pages. Three thick volumes, 2 columns, small print, many lines. So if it would be in English, it would be about 30-volume work in English on those 2 pages of that poem. So these were the books that were being written, but the main contribution of the Gaonim were their responsa. This became a new genre of Jewish law. Responsa means responses. People would write letters to these rabbis and say, what do I do in this case? What's the law? Because sometimes people did not know the Talmud, or if they knew the Talmud, this particular question was not mentioned in the Talmud. And they would write responses to these questions. And that became a whole genre of literature that exists to this day. As we're speaking today, there are dozens of great rabbinic scholars to whom people send questions of Jewish law, and they respond and they publish them. So I can't give you the exact number, but I think in an annual basis, there's probably 100 new volumes of responsa that are being published from rabbis all over the world, primarily in Israel, because people have questions that are not explicitly mentioned in the Talmud. Okay, so we have the period, the Gaonic period, as it's called, that ended about 1,000 years ago, when Babylonia ceased to be the main center. It still remained a center, but the larger centers were now being transferred to Germany, France, Spain, Morocco, and North Africa in general. And you had some of the disciples of the Gaonim spread all over. And that started a new period of Jewish scholarship, where the teachings of the Torah were being transmitted and interpreted, and that period was called Rishonim, the early commentaries. That period ended. There's no formal line. It says this is the last generation, but most people would say that it ended with the compilation of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, by Rabbi Yosef Karo. That began a new era called Achronim, the latter authorities. That was about 500 years ago. Rabbi Yosef Karo was one of the Jews who was expelled from Spain in 1492. So, and then he wrote the Shulchan Aruch decades later. So, we're talking about the early 16th century. So, that became a new era, and in every era, there are several different genres of Jewish law. There's number one, people who write commentaries on the Talmud. People who write commentaries on the commentaries of the Talmud. People who write commentaries on the commentaries of the commentaries of the Talmud. Then there's those people who focus mostly on systemizing Jewish law, putting together all this knowledge in a systematic way. Now there's probably about 1,000 volumes where scholars pick one subject, like just to think of something offhand, there's a whole book that talks about what are the laws that govern this period that we're in right now, Sphira, the counting of the Omer. A whole book just about this particular subject, where they collect everything that was said about it in a very systematic way, so it makes it easy for people to find practical guidance. The latest development in Jewish law is called the great rabbi, brilliant scholar, knows thousands of books by heart. His name is Google. He's also an expert on medicine. So you can find, believe it or not, you can find a lot of good material on Google. I don't recommend you living your lives according to Google, but it certainly is a great resource. Obviously. Right. So that's another genre where people are collecting the teachings and systemizing them and presenting them in a way that everyone who knows the language, and many of them are translated into English as well. That's a second area. A third area of Jewish law is responsa. As I said before, the great scholars, Reb Moshe Feinstein, for example, we have 9 volumes of his responsa, of his answers to questions that he was asked. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the former chief rabbi of Israel, who passed away a few years ago, who had the largest funeral probably in the world, almost 1 million people came to his funeral. That's in Israel. There's only 6-7 million Jews. 1 million came to his funeral. He wrote, right now, there's 11 huge volumes, plus another 6 smaller volumes, so it's about 17 volumes, besides all his other books. But just responsa, answers to questions of Jewish law. And there's a rabbi in Israel, I don't have his book, I have it on my computer, but I don't have it in hard copy. He's now up to volume 30-something of responsa, of answering questions. And these are more and more being written. So Jewish law is a very static thing and a very fluid at the same time. It's static that we don't change laws. We can't say, well, today, you know what, society is demanding that we change the way we view certain types of behavior. I'm not going to go into specifics. And therefore, we should live with the times and adjust Jewish law to that. If you do that, then why adjust it only to the times? Why not adjust it to your schedule? If it's more convenient for you to keep Shabbos on Tuesday, why not keep it on Tuesday? Why? If it's not divine, if you could play around with it, then you can play around with anything. And you know what? That's exactly what the youth has been saying. When the parents start to change the laws to satisfy a certain need, the children say, well, you changed, out of 613, you changed 100. I'm going to change all 613. I won't observe any of them. So in one sense, Judaism is very rigid. If it's part of Jewish law, it's something, unless the law itself tells you it's not always applicable and the law is lenient. Yes, there are times when Jewish law says that, yes, this is the way you should behave, but in times of difficulty, I'll give you an example. There are certain laws of kashrus that there's a dispute amongst authorities whether something is kosher or not. And it says you should follow the strict view, but let's say you will suffer a major loss, financial loss. Let's say a butcher who invested thousands and thousands of dollars in his meat, and there's a question, and the answer is not clear. There are different opinions. Yes, he will be told, try to be strict, but if he's going to suffer a major loss, the authorities will allow him to keep whatever it is that he has to keep. Well, obviously, when a life is in danger, everything is overridden to save a life. But we're talking about even financial difficulty. But that's because the law itself allows for that. But where the law doesn't allow for exceptions, you can't change it. On the other hand, Jewish law is constantly going through changes in the sense that they didn't have cell phones in those days. They didn't have the type of surgery we have these days. They didn't have all the modern things. So we have to then go back into the laws, try to understand what the principles behind them are, and see how they can be applied. One area of Jewish law that's being debated to this day is surrogate motherhood. Who is the real mother? The donor of the egg or the woman who carried the fetus for 9 months?
Is there a consensus?
Well, if you're a man, you shouldn't be having someone else's fetus, so it doesn't relate to you. I'm not going to answer the question because it's above my pay grade to answer that question. This is being disputed by the greatest authorities of Jewish law, and yeah. Well, it raises question. Now, they were told that the children are not Jewish because the host mother. Okay.
But the children were the product
of the donor. The donor was Jewish, right? Okay. There are different opinions, and it hasn't been resolved, as far as I know. I mean, I'm not up to date with the last.
They were insulted, and they said that this is their raw material that made these babies, and it was just a vessel, this Christian woman, and so, I mean, whoever.
Well, if I'll tell you, a personal feeling. If someone would tell me that there's a question about my Jewishness, I would jump into the mikveh in 2 seconds just to make sure that there's no question. And I would do whatever it takes, because why would I want to have any question?
When they grow up, you're not going to tell your future spouse, by the way,
well,
I'm the product of surrogate, and she wasn't Jewish.
Well, when a rabbi marries you, many rabbis don't do it because they're not aware of this. They have to ask a lot of questions. They have to ask questions about your ancestry. Make sure you're Jewish. You have to ask questions about whether your parents were married before and whether they had a kosher get.
It was a several-day process.
Right. You'll need to ask this question as well. Were you adopted? Were you a product of a surrogate mother? These are all going to be questions because the outcome could affect the person for life if you don't do it the right way. But I'm giving this as an example. There are so many issues that were not discussed in the Talmud. It's certainly not directly and explicitly, but we have to then try to find the principles and apply them to new situations. So it's constantly having new and new teachings that reflect what Jewish law would say about developing and changing situations. So we're not changing the laws, we're applying the laws to new situations, which is what it was always done, except now it's becoming more challenging because of technology. You know, for 2,000 years, technology was more or less in one place. And now there's this explosion. There's going to be many, many more difficult questions. There are questions about cars that drive by themselves, many ethical and legal questions. If the car is programmed, let's say if God forbid the car is going to hit someone, and the car is taught by the computer to move away, but it'll hit another person. Who decides which person's life takes precedence? Let's say it's one person versus two people. Do you allow it to kill one person to save two lives? These are not new questions, by the way, but new applications, and they will be debated and argued for a long time. Yes? That's right, because all the answers are really implicit in the Torah. We just have to find them. So we're constantly discovering new ideas. In fact, the Talmud says this following statement: every novel idea that a worthy student thinks of was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So if you think of it, let's say you're studying the weekly Parsha, and you come up with a nice insight that explains something that was not explained before. If it's a legitimate commentary, I mean, it's not off the wall, then what you thought of is not new. It was given at Mount Sinai. It was implicit in the teachings that were given at Mount Sinai. But it took, King Solomon also says in Ecclesiastes, God made everything in its season. That some things, some pieces of knowledge were not known to people for centuries. All of a sudden, 20 rabbis at the same time think of the same idea. There's a word for it in English, synchronicity. Where does that come from? Because there was a point in time when that knowledge was supposed to be kept secret, and then when the time came for it to be revealed, many people could think of it at the same time, without consulting with one another. So the end result is that the Torah that we have today, all the knowledge of Judaism, comes back to Mount Sinai, to Moses receiving it at Mount Sinai. Does that mean we can't make mistakes? No. God gave the Torah to humans, and he knows that humans could make mistakes. In fact, there's a tractate in the Talmud, what the Sanhedrin does when it made a big mistake. It told people, you know what? This type of idol worship is not banned. It's not really idol worship, you can do it, and it turns out they were wrong. They have to bring in a special sacrifice, an atonement for it. So the fact that they made a mistake doesn't mean that what they said was totally wrong. It means that God put the ideas in their mind, and then there's a way of correcting it. And if you look at the greatest of scholars, I have a manuscript, a copy of it, of course. If I had the original, I would be on the pay grade to answer it. But I have a copy of Maimonides' writings where he crosses out things. You see his crossing out and correcting it. And Maimonides, one of the greatest minds that ever lived, was constantly revising his work. He was constantly adding, subtracting, changing. And that's why Yemenite Jews have a much better understanding of Maimonides than all other Jews. Why is that? Because when Maimonides corrected his manuscripts, he sent it to Yemen. Because the Yemenites loved Maimonides because he helped them so much. When they had a crisis, he wrote a whole letter, Igeret Teman, so they considered him to be their primary teacher. To this day, there's no group of people that follow Maimonides as consistently as the Yemenite Jews. So now, no, they're not in Yemen anymore. They're in Israel now. We're talking about, yeah. Right, Yemenite tradition, right. So the Yemenite Jews always had access to the latest version of Maimonides' writings. All the other Jews, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, always had the earliest draft, because he didn't bother with all the other Jews. He focused mostly, he didn't have his photocopy machine. He couldn't make copies and send it all over. He could have put it on Twitter, no? Or on Facebook, right. But he didn't. So what happened, if you look at a standard edition of Maimonides' writings, we have his earliest version. The Yemenites have the latest version. So now, one of the great Yemenite rabbis, Rabbi Kapach, published his version of Maimonides, which is the latest version of Maimonides, and you see the differences. It's fascinating to see how the mind works, how he originally thought and how he changed. And just to conclude with a story relating to this, Rabbi Soloveitchik, the great sage of the 20th century, came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he lost his mother to comfort the mourner, and they started a discussion, a halachic discussion about the laws of mourning. And the Rebbe said, Maimonides agrees with this opinion. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, no, there's no such writing in Maimonides. And so the Rebbe stood up to take the book out of the bookcase, and Rabbi Soloveitchik says, Lubavitcher Rebbe, don't trouble yourself, there is no such Maimonides, quote of Maimonides. So the Rebbe just left it at that. A few days later, the Rebbe sends him a letter and says, Maimonides writes what I said in this place in his commentary on the Mishna, but, he says, that was in the original edition. In the latest Yemenite edition, he deleted that, so you were right. So Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, he was so impressed that even though the Rebbe was really right, because Rabbi Soloveitchik didn't have access to the Yemenite edition, he guessed right that Maimonides changed his view, but he was so impressed that the Rebbe would say, you're right, when in fact he was right. In one sense, they were both right. Yes?
This is all men wrote the Torah, and it didn't come from Hashem promotion.
Okay, if a person is open and receptive to logic, then you can convince them. The problem is most people are not receptive, and the reason for that is because that would mean that the Torah is true, and that would mean they would have to change their way of living. So if I can convince you that the earth is flat, and because of that, you're going to have to change your whole lifestyle, you're not going to be receptive to it. But if it's not going to affect you, then I will convince you that the world is flat. You know the world is flat. Look, pretty flat here. In other words, what are you trying to do with that person? Try to convince them of something they're not prepared to accept.
They're trying to convince me that it's not true.
Well, how can they convince you?
They can't, but
You can't disprove something. You can't say, well, God didn't say the Torah. How do you know? You sitting next to God for the last 3,000 years, and you know everything He said. But the proof that it's true is a very simple proof. There's no culture in the world that has a tradition that God revealed Himself to millions of people simultaneously, and that these people took the teachings and they kept on transmitting it. If at any point in time someone would come and make up a story like that, let's say I might come to you in the class, they said, I want to tell you something. God showed Himself to all Americans, and He told them that this is who you should vote for. And you're going to say, all Americans? Aren't we Americans? I didn't know about that. I never heard about that. Let's say I said, okay, it happened 100 years ago. God revealed Himself during the Civil War to all Americans and told them they should stop fighting. People will just laugh at you. How can you make up a story like that? And that's why no religion makes up a story like that, because they know it can be easily disproved. So someone once said, but there is a religion that believes that God revealed Himself to a whole group. The Sikhs have that tradition. So a rabbi went to one of the Sikh leaders and he said, "You have such a tradition?" "Yes, we do." He says, "Well, what happened to all those people?" "Oh, they were all wiped out." Well, there's no unbroken chain. They themselves say that yes, God revealed himself to a whole nation, but there's nothing left of that nation. So obviously you have to put the trust in the people who made up the story, who said that the story was true. If you go back to any religion, Christianity goes back to one person and his disciples. Islam goes back to one person and his followers. Every religion traces itself back to one or several people, and once one or several people convince a whole group of people, then it could grow exponentially. Famous story, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz we used to have debates with Christian clergy, and once the priest was persistent, he says, look how many millions of Christians there are in the world. How could they all be wrong? And the rabbi is answering, and they're going and they're taking a walk, and they pass the church. And the rabbi says, look. And he says, what? You see the angels dancing on top of the spire of the church. And the priest looks and says, where? And the rabbi says, you don't see them? Well, the priest was embarrassed to say he doesn't see the angels, and the rabbi does. So he said, yeah, now I see them. So they're both pointing to the angels. Meanwhile, the people walking by see this spectacle, a rabbi and a priest. It almost sounds like a joke. I just need the minister. And they're both looking up in the sky. So they ask what's going on? So the priest says, the angels. And the people were embarrassed that they're not so pious that they don't see angels. Soon enough, hundreds of people are gathered around pointing to the angels. And then the rabbi said, obviously I made the whole story up. You see how easy it is to get a following? But Judaism doesn't trace itself back to Abraham. We trace ourselves back to Sinai, where all Jews, millions of them, 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. So if you project how many children, how many senior citizens, how many women, the estimate is 2-3 million people. All witnessed the same thing, and this is what they passed down. And at no point in time did anyone say, no, that you made it up. If someone would made that claim, it would have been recorded that we made it up. Yes.
Well, the 39 halachos.
Malachos.
That sounds
Yeah.
better.
It rhymes.
Is that from the oral law, or is that from the rabbis at the time?
No, that's part of the oral law, because, right, the Torah says don't do malacha, but if it doesn't say what it means, you give it to 10 people, you'd have 10 different definitions of it. What do you call malacha? Let's say we translate it as work. For one person, work is what he does in an office. For another person, it's what he does on his farm. For a third person, it's what he does, traveling. I mean, everyone has a different definition of work. For some people, it's heavy labor. For some people, it's something very simple.
And the second question is, you mentioned cryptic, teaching the Talmud. What is the code book the one teaching? Is it called code book, or is it a separate supplementary that goes with the Talmud?
You're talking about the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch?
Is that what it is, the Shulchan Aruch?
Yeah, that was written about 500 years ago, which codified Jewish law.
You said that when the Mishna was written,
Yeah. Oh, the Mishnah was written. It was written in a cryptic form.
Yeah.
In some very many cases, you cannot read the Mishnah and figure out exactly what it means. Some places it's clear, some places it's not clear, and that was by design. It was written in a way that guaranteed that you'd still have to go to your teacher. You couldn't just go to the library.
Where does the teacher have a separate book? Or
No, it was passed down orally.
Or they know how to read it.
Right. Now, all of that cryptic aspect of the Mishnah was clarified by the rabbis of the Gemara. The Talmud clarifies it.
Which we read in the commentaries.
Right, but the Talmud in a sense is a commentary on the Mishnah, but the Talmud is also, relative to a later generation, also cryptic, or at least shorthand. And depends where. Some places in the Talmud things are very clear, some places they're very unclear. So, right, yes.
ultimately a new and improved Shulchan Aruch?
There have been many versions of the Shulchan Aruch that were updated. After Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, if anyone has to leave, we usually end at 1. Yeah, I don't think anyone should feel they have to stay as long, because we should finish at 1 so people can go to work if they have to, or leave. But I'm glad to stay on to answer the question. When the Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he wasn't the first one to do that. As I mentioned before, the Gaonim already codified Jewish law, bringing it up to date. Then the next, and I gave you the example of Rabbi Chai Gaon. That was his work. And there were a few other works. One was called the Halachot Gedolot, is a compilation of laws, bringing the laws of the Talmud up to date and putting it in a different system, making it more accessible. Then there was the Rif, nothing to do with Raf. The Rif was Rav Alfas, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. What he did, he abridged the Talmud. So it makes the Talmud a lot more navigable, that you can find the practical aspects of it without all the arguments and the discussions. Then the next major work was Maimonides.
I think the word's navigational.
No, navigable.
Navigable?
Sometimes we make up words here. So the Maimonides was the next one. He was the most ambitious, because the others did not take all of Jewish law, and not in such detail, and not in such clarity and systemization. Maimonides was the most brilliant codification of Jewish law. But after Maimonides came the Tur. The Tur, he was an Ashkenazic rabbi who lived in Spain later. Actually, it's his father, the Rosh, Rabbi Usher, who codified the Talmud following the system of the Talmud. The Tur took his father's writings and rearranged them, and the Shulchan Aruch was based on the system of the Tur. After the Shulchan Aruch was written, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, the leading Ashkenazic rabbi, says, I don't like this book the way it's written, because he reflects a Sephardic approaches to everything, and I'm Ashkenazic, and we have to follow Ashkenazic opinions. So what he did, and rather than rewriting the Shulchan Aruch, he just added notes. And he called it the mappa, the tablecloth. Shulchan Aruch means the set table, so he called it the tablecloth. Then a student of Rav Moshe Isserlich was not satisfied with what was there, because he felt it was not accessible, so he rewrote the Shulchan Aruch, and he called it the levush, the garment. And then the next major effort was Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the founder of the Chabad movement. He rewrote the Shulchan Aruch and brought it up to date. And then there were others who did their versions of it. Then, generations later, there's someone who wrote called Aruch HaShulchan. No, Aruch HaShulchan. He reversed the name, and he brought it up to date. And then there's the Mishna Berurah, was the most recent codification. But then, as I said before, there are now scholars who take one subject and they treat it, with every little detail. Right, there's a book called Shmira Shabbos Kolchas. It's 2 volumes where he collects all the laws of Shabbos, and there were many compilations like that. Then there's a man who wrote a book called Nitei Gavriel. It's about 25 volumes. He covers all the holidays and a few other subjects as well. And as we're talking, I'm sure there's another book that was just published this morning.
So what do you follow? I
Oh.
don't know when to follow. There's so many.
You follow your local rabbinic authority.
LOR.
But it's a living thing that we're constantly looking for new meaning and new depth and applying it to new situations. And
What do you do if you're in a position where you need an immediate answer as to how to act, and there are no rabbis present?
oh, that's a good question. It depends on the type of question.
You can actually go to Rabbi Google.
Well, let's say you don't have a computer, there's no Google available, there's no phone that you can call someone. It depends what kind of a question it is. If it's a question of health, of life and death. Obviously, you do what you have to do. If it's a life and death does not mean that if you do this you'll die, and if you do this you'll live. It means if there's any possibility that what you're questioning could lead to putting your life in jeopardy, then Jewish law says you can do whatever you have to do. If it's not a life and death issue, a health issue, there's a general rule of thumb that if you have a question whether something is permissible or not, the rule of thumb is be passive. Whatever doesn't get you to do the act. I'll give you an example. This is a very tragic example. No, that's on Shabbos. Well, depends on the circumstances. Well, this happened during the Holocaust. A Jew had the ability to save his son's life, the son who was destined to be sent to the crematoria, to the gas chamber in crematoria. And he had some jewelry on him. He could have bribed the guard, the capo, happened to be Jewish, to let his son out. Well, no question, you can save your son's life. But they were afraid that the Germans would count the number of kids they had in their block, and if they found one kid missing, they would be punished. So they said, we will let your son go, but we're going to grab another child who was not in the death block, in his place. So this Jew, what is he going to do? He wasn't a scholar, so there was a rabbi there who survived the Holocaust and wrote about it, Rabbi Meisels from Chicago. And the rabbi pleaded with him not to ask him the question. He says, I can't answer this question. In the end, the Jew decided not to save his son's life. He says, the truth of the matter is, his decision was, quote unquote, halachically probably the proper decision, because to save his son's life would have meant actively killing another child. So he had to be passive. But that's a general rule. When you have a question about what's right or what's wrong, and what you may do is wrong, and if you don't do anything it's wrong, it's better to do something wrong passively than to do something wrong actively. But it's not always the right answer, because it depends on the circumstances. Obviously, if there's no one to ask and you don't know what to do, you have to go by your own judgment and pray to God that you make the right judgment. I mean, what does God expect of a person? Well, that means that you did whatever you were capable of doing. You tried to do the right thing, and since you had no rabbi around, no books around, no telephone around, no computer around, what are you expected to do? If you don't know, that if after you make your decision you realize you made the wrong decision, that's what you're asking, I think. You know what? The way the story is told, the man it was a Rosh Hashanah it happened, when we read about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And the way I remember reading in the book, the man was murmuring joyfully that he had actually given up his son's life to save another life. We can't judge that. I mean, we're not capable of judging that. Now, what happened afterwards, I don't know if the man survived the Holocaust. The rabbi survived. I don't think the man did. But that's, again, but let's for argument's sake, let's say you made a decision based on the best of your intentions and you discover that your decision was wrong. Obviously, you'll feel guilty about it, but the only reason you should feel guilty is if you had the ability to learn. You know, ignorance is not always a good excuse. If you're ignorant because you didn't take the initiative to learn, then you won't be held accountable for your mistakes, you'll be held accountable for not learning. But if you're not capable of learning, then you made a mistake, then God realizes that. If you believe that God is kind and just and fair, then He'll judge you fairly. There's no reason to feel guilty. And if you still feel guilty, that reminds me of another story. Also a Holocaust story. There was a guy who was on a death march together with his brother, And when they rested, they only had, each one rested, and the other one would stand guard, because the second they gave the signal to get online, if you didn't get online, they would shoot you. And the brother who was supposed to be awake fell asleep. And when they gave the signal to get online, he just woke up and ran to the line and didn't wake up his brother. And he never saw his brother again. So he had these pangs of guilt. So he went to his rabbi, and his rabbi didn't know the answer. So he wrote to another rabbi, Rabbi Breisch, a rabbi in Switzerland, who was one of the great, who wrote Responsa. And this rabbi shows that he has no reason to feel guilty. It wasn't his fault under the circumstances. You know, on this death march, people didn't have the strength to do anything. But he said that if he still feels guilty, he should channel that guilt into something positive. He feels guilty at the loss of life. Let him devote his life to restoring life. And he gives the example of having more children, or encouraging more children, or not embarrassing people, because embarrassing is like it says it's like killing someone. So he should encourage people to be more sensitive to the other people. In other words, if you have guilt, then channel it into something positive. Guilt is not necessarily a bad thing unless you wallow in it. Then it becomes destructive and just as bad as the thing that you feel guilty about. Because that's exactly what, one great Hasidic master said. What does a Yetzer Hara want of us, the evil impulse? To sin. No, he says that's not what he wants. He wants us to sin so we can become depressed. And that's, once you become depressed because of the sin, he controls everything you do. So if guilt, which leads to depression, is a negative thing, unless it's channeled into something positive, then it becomes a positive force. Okay.